Hello, and welcome to the New York Society Library, both those of you in the room and those joining us online. I am Sarah Holliday, the library's head of events, and I'm just here momentarily to say a word about tonight's speakers. First, may I ask everyone to be sure that cell phones or any disruptive device are silenced? And also let me mention that we are live streaming this evening, and everyone is welcome to ask questions and share comments during the Q&A portion. If you're joining us online, add those items to the chat. And I'm happy to mention that we have copies of tonight's book for sale here in the room or at the link that's in the video chat through our friends from the Independent Corner Bookstore. So do feel free to purchase a copy and get it signed by the authors at the end of the event. This library has collected books related to ancient history and biblical scholarship through most of our 269 years, and it's a strong element of our collection now. If this is an area of interest for you from any perspective, secular, spiritual, or scholarly, I highly recommend a walk through the rear of Stack 2 for books old and new on this subject. We're pleased to have with us tonight authors Natalie Renee Perkins and Hal Taussig to speak specifically about non-canonical works from the first centuries of Christianity. Natalie Renee Perkins is a graduate of Union Theological Seminary and works with the West Star Institute to bridge the gap between religious scholarship and the general public. She currently serves on the clergy staff at Middle Collegiate Church and as a chaplain for New York University. Hal Taussig recently retired as professor of New Testament at Union Theological Seminary. He was a founding member of the Jesus Seminar, the famous gathering of scholars to investigate the historical basis of the New Testament. Dr. Taussig has published 15 books, including After Jesus, Before Christianity, and A New Testament. He and his work have been featured in and covered by the New York Times, Time, The Daily Show, People, Newsweek, National Public Radio, the Philadelphia Inquirer, The Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC, Sirius Radio, the History Channel, and the Washington Post. Please join me in welcoming Natalie Renee Perkins and Hal Taussig. Transition. There we go.
Hello, all. Hi. Thank you for having us here in the room. We're really glad to be here. We are going to just start with a little conversation about these texts and why they're important, and I'm gonna let you start, but I tend to do a lot of talking, so let's let you get in there, and then we'll go from there.
There's a real oddness about the last 150 years of biblical scholarship, and it has mostly to do with the fact that about 150 new texts were discovered in the African setting and in the Mediterranean setting. That came out of nowhere, we thought. There's a reason why, but what has been stunning about this is these 150 texts completely rethink what the biblical and especially the New Testament scholarship is. This has been a difficulty for a lot of churches and a lot of scholars to take seriously 150 new texts and how they change that. Just a few little examples. There is, I think maybe someone in the room or online knows that one of those texts was called the Gospel of Mary. It's a stunning new kind of text that has Mary being the primary person in relationship to Jesus. And indeed, it has a picture of the basic dimension of Jesus being a colleague of Mary. The weird thing is that
Sorry.
That's all right. Thank you. The weird thing about the Gospel of Mary is that there are really three major Marys in the New Testament. Mary the mother, Mary Magdalene, but one of the amazing things is that in this case, we don't know which Mary. And it's not just three, but when one looks at the Marys of that era, of the first century, there we can say that of the women at that time in Israel, 1/4 of all of those were named Mary. So anyway, that just is a little, if you think of that on a level of 150 different new things, that shows the amazing tenure of how do we think about this in a bigger situation.
Yeah, you and I tend to call them extra canonical texts because they extend the canon. They were all of these texts were written around the same time as everything that might be in your traditional New Testament canon, but for one reason or another, we're left out. We do not obviously know the reasons because we were not there, but we can speculate based on the work that we've done. And also what we know was alive and doing the same things it does today in the 1st and 2nd centuries. So some of the things that come into play that cause us trouble now, that silence people now, we're also still, we got that stuff honest from our ancestors. These things are passed down and they make their way into the things that are written, which is why it's important to read around what's just on the page. The context is key. There's also some musical context that will come into play tonight. One of the collections that we work with, one of the texts we work with is called the Odes of Solomon, which is a collection of early Christian worship material found 1945 is when we got our hands on it. It actually was discovered by a scholar before that, but he does not remember exactly where he got it and when he got it. He just, as he was cleaning out his office, found these old papyri and was like, oh, right. So clean your room. Particularly if you're going to be a Bible scholar. It's really helpful for us. So I took a class with Hal when I was in seminary called Opening the Canon, I think was the name of that class. And one of the projects he gave us in that class was to just take these texts and see what new life we could breathe into them, I guess, is the best way to describe it in a sentence. And I ended up writing a few songs using these texts. Each of them is a different genre to signify, one, that these would have all come from different Christianities, which even that word is, we'll talk about that word. And then also to identify the different ways in which we do our own spiritual and religious work now. So each song is a different genre for those two reasons. And you'll hear some of that now as we go through. Well, in a minute we go through. Just a little warning, there's some class participation, if you are willing. So not a lot. And then at the end we'll take some questions or protests as you may have them. We're looking forward to a rich conversation. Is there anything else? Oh, let's talk about the word Christianity before we move into some of the readings.
Hardly anyone also knows that basically the word Christian or Christianity is not used in the first 2 centuries of what's readily called Christianity. In other words, the people who were allegedly Christian didn't know the name. And so one of the really interesting things about our life in scholarship and in spirituality is to notice that there's a time to rethink what these early texts of the first 2 centuries were.
Yeah. You'll find in the book the word Jesus people or Jesus peoples or Christian, like all of them are used. Can you speak why we use these different words?
Mainly because we're trying to not use a word that they didn't know,
Yeah.
meaning Christian.
Mm-hmm.
But also what we've seen in recent scholarship is that it's really clear that there are all kinds of different Jesus peoples of the first 2 centuries. There's no central office of the whatevers. And so that means that across the first 2 centuries, there are all kinds of different things going on, not only spiritually, but in terms of scholarship as to what these things, what is happening with a bunch of different kinds of these Jesus peoples. We really have to use the word not Jesus people, but Jesus peoples.
Mm-hmm. I think we should get into it, unless there's another thing you want to say before we get down.
Oh yeah, just to say that I think the book itself, this new book is very, very new in that, although both of us have done authorship in this field, but this is probably the first one in which we take these new texts, new ancient texts, and we want to think about that in terms of the 21st century and what the meanings are in the 21st century.
This is your first moment of participation. Maybe your only. We'll see how this goes, eh? This reflection is from the Gospel of Mary, and it's called Let It Shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. She sang with the choir. It was Children's Sunday at church, and this was their big song. They had been practicing for weeks. Jess had earned a big solo, and she'd been practicing extra hard all week long in preparation. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. All in my home, I'm gonna let it shine. Her mama had taken her on a trip to the beauty salon yesterday for a special hairdo instead of having Auntie Cece come over with her hot comb. Mama said she could choose whatever style she wanted. But when Mama returned to pick her up and saw the faux hawk with her curls and kinks loose and the 2 braids dangling past her ears with beads on the bottom, the color drained from her face. If that's what you wanted, Jessie, her mama said. Her mama was a fierce lover of opera, so she never abbreviated Jess's name like her friends did. She knew her mama wanted to get her to get something more appropriate for church. But Jess didn't care. She thought this hairstyle made her look more grown up. She couldn't wait to try on her new dress with her ruffled socks and patent leather shoes. All the other girls her age were wearing pantyhose, but Mama said 12 was too young and she'd have to wait until she was in high school. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. It was time for her big solo. God gave it to me. I'm gonna let it shine, she sang, throwing in a couple of extra notes and changing the melody slightly like she practiced over the week. Yes, Lord, let him use ya, she heard from the amen corner. As they drove to church this morning, Jess was nervous. She was absent-mindedly going over the verse in her head while Mama listened to the preacher on the radio. She heard him say, "Beware that no one lead you astray, saying, 'Look over here,' or 'Look over there.' For the child of humanity is within you. Follow it. Those who seek it will find it. Then go and proclaim the good news of the realm." Gospel of Mary 4:3-8. She felt like that preacher was speaking just to her. She knew that this morning God was within her, and she was proclaiming the good news through song. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. As she finished, the congregation applauded. You could hardly hear the group of little ones in front of her singing, hide it under a bushel, no, I'm gonna let it shine. She smiled, knowing she'd done her best to praise God on this special day. This next one has some music with it from the album that I mentioned before. The album is called Songs of Your Truth and is available on any of the places where you would get music. You are also holding a copy of it. Just a second to find that one. Here it is. This one's called Getting Ready and is from the Odes of Solomon. Odes of Solomon 13 specifically. Toby, thank you. Toby's anxiety was mounting. It had been for a long time, but finally actually making the doctor's appointment to talk about transitioning made the whole thing more real. They knew they were just at the beginning of a long and important journey, but fear of rejection from friends and family was mounting. Toby had kept their desire to transition from their family and everyone in their community, quietly saving money while settling for painting their nails fun colors and piling their long dark locks into messy bun on the top of their head. Every Sunday, Toby stood up on a platform stage at the front of a large auditorium full of people to lead the congregation in praise and worship at the beginning of service. Toby served on a team of people at the church whom Toby was afraid would say, "We love you and respect your decision," but would come back later as Toby was transitioning and say, "We don't think it's a good idea to have you serve in a leadership position at the church anymore." Toby shuddered at this thought. They deeply loved their ministry work as an expression of their love for the Lord. Also, Toby was afraid of losing their job when they needed their insurance more now than ever on this journey. Toby was surrounded by people who referred to being gay as a lifestyle choice. If that's what they thought about sexuality, Toby couldn't imagine this community would accept a gender transition. Toby had watched their father try to convince their uncle using clobber texts from the Bible that homosexuality was a sin and that he must turn away from his life to avoid eternal damnation. Toby's father had begged and pleaded with Toby's uncle. After that, Toby's uncle no longer spoke to the family. But Toby was still connected with him on Facebook, and their uncle seemed happy and he'd found a welcoming and affirming church community. Toby worried. Would they lose their church community and maybe even their family? Toby absentmindedly noodled on the guitar while thinking it through. They'd recently come across an ode in a collection of ancient Christian worship material that they couldn't get out of their mind. They shifted a couple of words and rearranged some others, and suddenly, Toby had a song.
The Lord God is our mirror. Open your eyes and see God in them. Learn the manner of your faces and announce to the Spirit praises. Wipe the dirt from your faces. Love the Lord's holiness and put it on. Then you will not at any time be blemished in front of God. Hallelujah. Hallelujah.
Toby didn't know what would happen on this journey, but no matter what happened, they knew that God saw them. Toby knew they were blemished. They were not blemished in front of God. And Toby prayed that people could see God in Toby's eyes and Toby's whole being as it changed in the coming years. This body didn't fit. It had never felt like Toby. They had come to terms with that. They had found community online to help them think through what it meant and what to do. Toby didn't know what would happen with their church community if they'd resist changing pronouns, insist on dead naming them, pressure Toby into some very uncomfortable conversations, hold Toby at arm's length. But Toby knew this was a journey they needed to take. Toby wasn't ready, but was working on getting there. Toby saw this transition as becoming more themselves, as the ode said, wiping the dirt from their face so the mirror of God was more visible. As Toby got ready for rehearsal with the band, they threw on a slim black tunic that went down to their knees over ripped, faded jeans. Toby added a red plaid flannel over top and slung their guitar strap across their shoulder. Toby decided that today they would teach the praise and worship team this song. The image of God is always visible in each person. If toxic ideologies, in this instance transphobia, were wiped away, the image of God would be easier to see. In this story, Toby has opened their eyes and found the image of God within them, regardless of the body they were born into. Many around this country and this world go bravely into communities that may not accept them or have already rejected them, knowing that they are not blemished in front of God. Hallelujah. Okay, so you've heard a couple of them now. Could you hear that song okay? The speaker did not kick on.
Sure.
Oh, great. And online it worked okay? Yay, wonderful. Okay. Experiment in the world that seemed to have gone well. Let's talk a little more about the stories that are in this book. This is a very meaningful and deep feeling book. And you got to be a thinker. You have to be the kind of person who wants to read between the lines, who is not going to be looking at just surface face value. And there are people written into these texts, or into this book rather, that you generally don't get to see in books like this that I've seen before, be it in devotionals, reflections. I don't know that I've ever read a trans person in a devotional before. And this is a result of us trying to make sure that everyone has space. Like it says, once you wipe away thousands of years of orthodoxy and orthopraxy, once you read between the patriarchy or the sexism or the phobias, then you see everybody actually was there all along. So that's an important goal for us that helps connect the 1st and 2nd century to today. So there's a big, heavy focus on marginalized people throughout the book. I think that there's also a big, heavy focus on people who are in a moment of transition in their lives, be it in this way a very physical, real transition, or the beginning of something new in their lives, or the end stage of something throughout the book. That also was something that we're all carrying throughout. And all the stories are not tied up nicely with a bow. They don't all have happy endings because we don't all live that way. Or maybe I don't live a life where everything is tied up in a bow and everything's happy endings. And it feels a little more real that way, to acknowledge that we're all still trying to do this thing and hold a hope in the midst of and in spite of all the things that are happening around us.
And I would like to basically point at this diversity both in the first 2 centuries and in the current century. In other words, it's strange for many people, but basically the first 2 centuries was varied tremendously. They didn't have common projects. And so here, what we are doing in this case is to see in our day a similar possibility of a range of senses, a range of meanings, and a range of music.
As the eyes.
That's interesting. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah. And so we are seeing already as the book comes out, we're seeing a great range of responses to the diversity of the first 2 centuries and the diversity of our time.
Is there anything else you want to say, or should we read our last one and get to the questions and protests?
The questions and protests will be fun.
I also want to say that this book, In Trembling, the title of this book,
Something is happening.
In Trembling Boldness is a line from one of the texts from Found a Perfect Mind. I am she who exists in all fears and in trembling boldness, which is the same way in which we see all these people kind of navigating something in their lives in the way that we see that we all are showing up to a wide variety of things today.
It's a quirky title, but we're really excited about it because it blends trembling and boldness. And by and large, it seems to me that a lot of religions think that you separate trembling and boldness, whereas at the heart of this text is holding up those two in a common place, trembling and boldness.
That text does that a lot, actually. Places things that you would actually generally think of maybe as binaries or dichotomous, and makes you really confront them almost as parallels, as partners through life. And there is such a richness that comes out of bringing things like that, the trembling boldness is existing in all fears, and so on and so forth. That's a really powerful text. If you don't know, well, you get the book, and you'll be introduced to all kinds of texts that you don't know, you may or may not know, but maybe have a new appreciation for if you already do. This last one we're going to read is from the Odes of Solomon again. It is Ode 5. And it's called Stronger Than Yesterday. Imagine late night in a dark, haze-filled jazz club. Musicians gather once a week to hone their skills, to play with different combos and different people, to experiment. A woman walks up to the stage area, which is really just a space in front where the tables have been pushed aside. She whispers to the musicians who nod, intrigued. Then she steps up to an empty mic where the soloing horn player normally stands. Usually there aren't singers, but he scoots aside to allow her space. The band plays a walk-down introduction that's a little crunchier, a little dirtier than what they've been playing. It sounds more like blues. The woman opens her mouth, releasing a wail, somewhere between a riff and a plea. She pauses, and the low din of murmuring is gone. Even the clinking of glasses from the bartenders has halted. The consistently dripping faucet seems to hold its drop. The wail escapes her painted red lips again, seeming to come from the depths of her soul. The band remembers they are there and kicks back in, filling 4 beats, then silence again. The singer starts and then, seemingly frustrated with not being able to land on words big enough to describe why, she lands on she begs. The band picks up for another 4 beats.
Because you are my home.
Then the band settles in with her into the dirty blues. She lifts her hand and drags it across the air as if she's conjuring up this dark mist. It is only then that you notice the shiner surrounding her left eye that makeup did little to cover. She sings.
And there be no light for them by which they might see, so that they will not see me. Let their minds become swollen, and let whatever they have devised return upon their heads. Truly they have devised a judgment for them to do, and they were
As she holds that last note, her arms rise from her side, hands splayed and head leaning back toward the ceiling as she's singing to the sky. It is only then that you notice the track marks in her right arm.
My hope is upon the Lord. Because the Lord is my redemption. He is a crown upon my head. If everything else should be shaken, if once it's I will not
The band stops playing. She sings alone, almost with the same pleading sound from earlier. Loud, weary, but determined.
will not die, and I am with him.
There's a stunned silence before the room erupts in applause. She trembles a bit as she leaves the playing area. Her shoe catches the frayed carpet and she stumbles a little. When she looks down to catch herself, it causes her hair to fall over her face. It is only then that you notice the bruising around her neck. Despite the obviously difficult life this woman is living, she is still fighting to live it. Like the writer of the ancient ode she sings, she refuses to give up. This story doesn't give any clues as to how the woman came to know and sing this ancient ode, but there seems to be on both ends plenty of dangers, toils, and snares along the way. Yet, both of them, through a song sung thousands of years apart, fight hard to claim their tomorrows. Yeah. It's not all pretty.
But we'd really like to have you respond back to us now, taking on whatever you'd like to about this, and so that we can have a deepening conversation.
I want to add, as we're preparing for questions, these stories that we wrote, some of them come from our work as ministers and holding people in life. Some of them we made up, some of them are our own personal stories. That is not my personal story, just to alleviate any concern in the room. But yeah, we pulled from a bunch of different sources in order to try and make sure that that there's no way to get everyone, but that a lot of people are in pages that have never found their way to bookstore shelves in people's homes.
In fact, last night I read a piece that was from a Muskogee person that I knew.
Yeah.
If it's one's goal to think about non-canonical texts as extra-canonical, to maybe establish more of a foothold and a relationship with them in one's heritage, in one's denomination. How would you imagine one could go about doing that without somehow cheapening the text? Because I feel like there's even with the text that we have, for instance, in the Apocrypha, they're always kind of treated as the redheaded stepchild, as it were. They're not really given the same kind of, I think, respect or reverence that the canonical texts are. And so my desire has always been to really be able to speak about these more within community, but there's always that underlying fear that then you just treat it as you do Psalms and Proverbs and everything else, which is kind of in one ear, not the other, if I'm being really honest about that. There's such I think, a fresh perspective to these and a real power to these and a possibility for real transformation. But how does one go about doing that when there is a kind of strain, I think, within mainline Christianity to say that to even look at texts like this is not part of the Christian ethic and not part of what it means to really show up as someone who follows Jesus?
I'm gonna let you go first.
I think the main thing that I would have to say over the past 20 years of working on this in very public settings, that there is real shift going on in a whole bunch of churches. I can't even count anywhere near all of the pastors I know preaching those texts. They're everywhere, and it's making a lot of congregations grow because there's a new character to what's going on in them. So I would say there are, and also one of the main things in terms of publishing now. We scholars and spiritual people, we're getting a lot of publication, and some of the biggest parts of religious publishing now is coming from that side. So I would say, yes, you're right. Your read is clear, and I didn't have a chance to, as I did last night, to say that in the first 50 years of the 2000s, of the 1900s and 2000s, basically scholars tried to make this a false thing. Very actively, scholars who didn't even have particular religiosity wanted to make this be some kind of heretical or second rate. And it's been only in the last 30 or 40 years that we see a breakthrough in that regard as well. So I don't want to take away from your question. It's really there, but I would say nationally and internationally, I don't ever not get a request for that.
I want to add to that. I think the way that you approach it with a congregation is really important. So I preach these texts at the church where I serve. You preached them when you were um, doing all the every Sunday preaching. And I think at least the way that I went about it to introduce it into the space is I preached from the traditional canon and then would be like, and I also, this other text says blah, 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 blah. And they were like, oh, well, that's really interesting. And then I would preach from the actual other text and tie that back to the canon so that people can see these texts were in conversation with each other the entire time. We're the ones that are missing all of the cues around how they connect. And the other part of that is the classes that you hold around those particular texts, just like you would hold a Bible study around the canon that people know, and the touring that we've done to talk about some of these texts that people come to, and then they take it back to their congregations or their groups.
And just next month, we're going to a very big music festival because we were asked to bring it and do this both in terms of giving lectures as well as songs. We'll have a good 1,000 or 2 people coming to that because that's what they do every July. Yeah.
Are the new texts in your book?
Yes. Oh, you mean at all of them?
The actual script of the text.
Of the new texts that were found or rediscovered?
This book holds an introduction into what those texts are, and then reflections on a particular scriptures, I call them, from these texts. But if you're looking for a full version of these texts, you'll find a lot of them in a book that Hal edited and put together with a whole bunch of scholars called A New Testament. I think all of them are in there except for Norea, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But the rest of them from this book are in that. Do you want to tell them about that book just briefly so they have an idea what it is?
Quickly, so this is in its second decade and is basically publishing better than it was when it came out with a major publisher. So this was Houghton, Mifflin, and Harcourt. Yes, go ahead.
So Jesus was always Jewish, and so his followers were Jewish. I mean, that's why they didn't need to be called Christian because they were Jewish, right?
That's a major reason, yes, but because of that, there's so many different characteristics of ongoing groups in the first 2 centuries that understood themselves as a part of the people of Israel. In other words, there wasn't even a thought about that, even when there was perhaps other kinds of things going on with Jesus. There were people who came from other kinds of religion who understood that what they were doing when they were getting into this material is they were joining Israel.
So I think I'm right in saying that many of these texts are from what we would refer to as Gnostic traditions, whether that's a really good universal word for them or not. And I know that Gnosticism has resonated with some contemporary writers. I think Harold Bloom is one of them who talks about Gnosticism off and on in his writings. But I feel like for a lot of people, even with an interest in this period, it's kind of a turn-off word. It's kind of one of those weirdos over there in the Gnostic category somehow. I think that attitude may be derived from the people who chose the canon and left these things out, that the Gnostics are the weirdos over there somewhere. Can you tell us a little bit about what Gnosticism was, what it has to do with these texts, why maybe we shouldn't be afraid of it if we want to read ancient texts.
Yes, thank you so much. I've done a lot of publishing on this. I won't do a lot of talking, but I want to say clearly that in the first half of the 20th century, scholars called these texts Gnostic as a way of making it second class. But the main thing that I want to say is especially, let me mention two of my wonderful colleagues, Karen King at Harvard and Elaine Pagels at Princeton. Karen first has said the word Gnosticism did not exist in those centuries. The first time that Gnosticism was in a vocabulary was in the 17th century. In other words, it is so patent that in different parts of Christianity, this was a way of casting a pall on those texts. The wonderful thing that happened, some of you know that Elaine Pagels had her wonderful coming out book right here in New York, and she called it the Gnostic Gospels. And Karen and I and others said, "Are you sure you want to use that term?" Because the wonderful thing about what Professor Pagels did is she made these texts known. She wasn't doing that to make a put down. It was the best thing that happened to these texts. But what is even more important is Professor Pagels, about 10 years ago, in response to Professor King, said she doesn't think that her students should use Gnosticism anymore as any kind of text. As to who that is. I want to say also just one thing, because I myself know a lot of Gnostics in our day. That is, people who say they are Gnostics and have churches like that. So I don't mean to say that somehow there's something wrong with them. I just want to say that this way of talking about it was primarily trying to make something wrong about some other person's texts.
It's interesting that happened. You said the 17th century is when that first.
Yeah.
And we had the invention of the printing press in the 16th century, which is when we were able to.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Be like, these are the only books
Yeah.
for sure now because we've written it down and everybody can have it,
Yeah.
I have a comment and then a question. The comment is a little facetious, but it sounds like that the early Jesus people were Unitarians. Which I happen to be one.
How fun.
And the question is, does the diversity of the Jesus people support the idea that they were also followers of the ancient idea of cynicism, or were ancient cynics?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's one of the earliest kinds of recognition. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Would Paul have been in that same category, possibly?
Well, first of all, he understood himself as a new kind of person of the people of Israel. And so, yes, he certainly, so many people of, I don't use the word Judaism until the 2nd century because of the Greek there, but basically the wonderful thing about, quote, Judaism in the first 2 or 3 centuries was it's all kinds of, it also is in all kinds of different groups. In other words, there was no Judaism per se, there were a bunch of Judaisms.
I'm going to add just on the Paul front, one of the texts in the book is the Acts of Paul and Thecla, which has, I think, the only description we have of what Paul looks like, his physical appearance, and it's a delight. I'm very amused by that.
It's a really hilarious quote, yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about the role of music in these texts at the time that they were written, like, and music and drama, and why you use music so much now in producing them?
So the collection of early Christian worship material, the Oath of Solomon, we imagine came from, well, I guess it depends on the scholar you talk to. A lot of scholars think that this material came from a lot of different places and then became this one collection. There are other scholars who are like, no, they wrote all of these, and we just happen to find this one group's material. And it's written in, some of them you can tell are songs, some of them look like plays or that they might have been acted out. So it'll say like, Christ speaks here, or, you know, or it'll say like the one or the many, like, so it looks like here a lot of people might have spoken and then someone else would have played the role of Christ here and said these things, and maybe it was sung, and some of them are written in a poetic pattern that looks like it may have been maybe a song or a poem. Some of them are written a little more like a story. And I think that is the way in which they were able to get these things out past themselves, so they have lives, out past their own communities. People tend to remember the songs you sing, right? Because it also brings forth some sort of other emotional energy. And in that same way, I am also a professional performer, musical theater, and a composer and arranger, all the things. And so in interacting with those texts, specifically the Odes of Solomon, when I was reading them, I just started hearing melodies come to mind. And I was like, I had to well, didn't write them down because it was 6 a.m, but I was, hit the little voice memo button on my phone. Thanks be to God for that invention. So then you can write it down later when you're a little more, you know, with it. And it ended, now, even today, as that music makes its way out into the world, helps other communities do kind of the same thing, right? So someone will hear the song, I'll get people reaching out and be like, hey, can we use this song in our community to do insert reason here, United Women's Methodist Women's Conference, or this children's choir, or this group of people who are doing this meditation. You know, they all meet a different need that helps to carry this thing past itself, right? And also creates a spiritual moment that everyone can kind of collect around.
If I may say just one thing, the national music character of Professor Perkins is Reverend Perkins is really a major fact in how all of this is going. So I'm glad to be a part of this with you. The second thing I would say is we're making way big progress on being able to find when a song is being sung in Greek or Coptic or Hebrew of that age. We've been working on it for a century or two, in finding how the Greek and Coptic and Hebrew songs align themselves musically. And so I think that there's a lot of that going on in all kinds of regular Christianity, regular Judaism, and experimental.
Languages, what, are they all one particular language or several?
Several, yeah.
Mhm.
We have Coptic, we have, is there Aramaic in there?
There is some Aramaic in there, yeah.
What else? What else is in there?
Well, a lot of Coptic
A lot of Coptic, a lot of
Yeah.
Aramaic, there's another one.
and Greek.
Greek.
How does something get to be called the gospel? Not all 150 of the texts could be considered gospels, could they?
No.
And if it's a gospel, what is it writing about?
Thank you. That I'll say a little bit on this. So as far as many of us can tell scholarly, the word gospel in that time is derivative of the Roman Empire. Of the Roman Empire. That is, there are lots of the emperor talked about who he was and talked about how he was God by saying that he was proclaiming gospel. The word gospel means good news, and what he was saying is all the good news in these centuries are coming from the emperor, who is decidedly full of violence. So, in other words, what happened, as far as I and many others see, is that the Jesus peoples put that and turned it upside down. In other words, the emperor was the first to claim gospels in his own way, and the Jesus peoples meant to turn that upside down as to what it meant.
Could you clarify that? Really
Oh, I'm sorry. So the word gospel in Greek means good news. It was used primarily as a political word that the emperor used about himself and what he was doing in that time. And so that because he was the emperor was saying that about him and him as a divine character for all of the former nations that he had.
He was claiming divinity.
He was not only divinity, but the word gospel. And it was then the Jesus peoples who said, we have another meaning for that.
Thank you.
So I would say those Jesus peoples were making a satire on the emperor.
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which is a dangerous thing to do.
Yeah, right.
Costing people some lives.
What do the texts talk about? I mean, that's a hard thing. Are they talking about the life of Jesus, or what are they talking about?
What
Some of them are. Some of them are talking about Jesus. The Ode of Solomon is uses Christ. Under perfect mind, Jesus doesn't come up at all. It is about female deity, mostly mostly identifies as female, but also some places where this deity identifies as male. The Acts of Paul and Thecla is mainly about Thecla's journey as she is trying to be a teacher and a healer in a time where women were not allowed to do this sort of thing. But she is teaching about Jesus. Norea does not mention Jesus at all. That's the text. That one is more wheelhouse than mine, which is why I'm looking over his way. And then there are some prayers. There are a wide variety. Gospel of Mary does talk about Jesus, but that one is mainly because the middle is missing, which I have a real theory about why the middle is missing, which is #patriarchy. Like I think somebody just got a hold of it and really felt a way about there being a female who got to write a thing and that they wrote all of this, and so we're just going to destroy. I'm sure they probably just tried to destroy all of it, but the middle is what's missing. So what we have is the beginning and the end, and it's really just telling the story of how Mary was pretty central. So it's a woman in leadership, which would have been, a problem in a kingdom.
And the one short thing I would add is that in as much as one knows in the Gospels what Jesus said, he was very hesitant to say much about himself. So there, in other words, the teachings of Jesus aren't about Jesus. They're about other things.
Mm-hmm. The Gospel of Thomas is just sayings and deeds. There's no midrash or connective tissue. It's just Jesus said this, and he said this, he said this, he said, then he did this, and then he said this, and this, he said, so very much like that.
Thank you so much, Reverend Perkins.